Dzień dobry Państwu, dziękuję za liczne...
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for gathering here on Saturday morning. My name is Rafał Tomański, and next to me, that's the most important thing, Professor Bogdan Góralczyk and Katarzyna Golik, PhD, who will talk about modern China, what it looks like, what are the faces of modern China, and do those faces go hand in hand with our expectations? So there are lots of topics to be covered today. We've got 1 hour and 15 minutes for the discussion, and I would also like to add at the very beginning that I have a nice quotation for us. Lately, a translation of a Chinese writer was published, Explosion Chronicle. He's a famous writer who's very popular, although he's not allowed to publish in China. And let me quote him. Today, China is going forward at a very high, fast pace in order to be faster than the USA and the rest of the world. The aim of China is to be as effective and as efficient as possible. They are driven by money and by efficiency. Every day they take actions which are really horrible. As you can see, the content of this book is really sad. The boundaries between what's beautiful and what's horrible are blurred. The author also writes that logics in China makes no sense as logics is being negated in the country. And we are talking about a country which is, in economic and political terms, one of the first in the world. How would you respond to this quotation? Well, I have a very simple quotation. When we have a look at the Chinese discourse, main discourse, broad discourse, and not the representation of dissidents, they show us what the situation is in the European Union. They are laughing at Trump, and they say that in their political system, Trump would be no one because he's not equipped with the right tools to govern a country. So it is an ideological fight. But the truth is what you read at the very beginning. It's impossible to call China an ordinary country, although it is supposed to be understood as the country of the middle. It is a huge continent, and it outnumbers the European Union 3 times, which is really important. And we should also remember that it is an ancient civilization which survived, which has its values, which has its systems of values which are not in line with our systems of values. And let me add one more thing. I can see translators in the room, but as I see it, most of the listeners are Polish, so let me add a Polish perspective here. Well, our relations with China have not and are not good. Some of you might know me. You know that I deal with China and Hungary at the same time. And in Hungary, 4th of June 1968, 89, evokes no associations, but in Poland it is an important date, first free elections and Tiananmen Square. For 20 years we've got an ideological attitude towards China. We young ideologists, we wanted to fight autocrats. And then there was a shock of 2008, and Western media started to perceive China as growing superpower, which and in Poland this translated into our perception of China. And you might remember when the Law and Justice Party when China started to be ruled in 2015, the situation changed and it was really difficult. This was the second stage, and for the past 1.5 years, since 2017-2018, a different chapter has started to be written in relations between China and the West in two most important strategic American documents, a strategy of military actions and strategy of security. China has been indicated as a strategic counterpart, a strategic challenge. And then the era of Kissinger came to an end, and another era started, an era of something totally different, an era of strategic competition. And Stephen defined us in the right way. We were faced with a very classic dilemma, both us and people in Asia. Do you love more, mommy or daddy? In Poland, we have no dilemma like that. We've got one big brother behind, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. So the situation is clear. We have nothing to think about. But now the situation has changed a bit, and we might think about why this change took place. Okay, let me refer to the quotation. When it comes to Professor Góralczyk's and mine perspective, well, they are complementary. I'm looking, I do not have an umbrella perspective, but I rather have a look at smaller things, details. Let's remember that whatever we say about China, we will find examples to confirm our thesis. There is the perspective of elites, of intellectuals, and there is also perspective and dynamic of social changes, social processes. And obviously the quotation indicates the current state of consciousness of people in China. This group of people is growing in number, and they can see that there are no more social bonds, and the pace of changes is really fast. The changes that took place during industrialization and other periods in other parts of the world take place in China at a very fast pace. In some regions in China, there were rural areas, villages stemming from the 19th century without electricity. I have high respect towards Xi Jinping. He was able to go away from the doctrines he knew, and he led China through reforms, economic reforms. He said no to the ideology back then, but what comes next? We want to be pragmatic, but if we reject an ideology, we also reject some value systems. Nothing is of interest to us. We might do whatever we want just to be wealthy. But from the other perspective, looking at what Mr. Góralczyk said, lately someone said that in New York more money is spent on drugs than the entire money spent on healthcare in Russia. And aren't we terrified with what's going on in the USA if such things happen? I think we should also be terrified about the USA and what they do, because it seems they have large issues. So there are lots of social crises and a range of responses to those crises. So, well, it will also be problematic for us because the micro and macro scale will not be coherent all the time, and it will be difficult to go from one level to another. Both of those levels are genuine, but it's not possible for them to be coherent all the time. Thank you for saying that there are also things which we should not be happy about when it comes to ourselves, the Western part of the society, because there are also problems in our societies. There are issues with our values. That's also something we should remember. We also want to be wealthy. We want to live a better life, and maybe it's impossible to strike a balance between values and wealth. And another issue is what you said about Mr. Trump. He would be no one in China because he doesn't have the right tools. Of course, we all understand what you meant, but lately I've read opinions by Chinese people who think that Trump would be better for them because he can be bought. There is a price to buy a Trump ad, and if there is no order, if there are no principles, rules, it's easy to negotiate under such circumstances if you are rich. Well, it's Saturday morning, and a lot of you have gathered here. I assume you've come here to learn some things, and I'll tell you something which is not very well known in Poland, and this will be a response to your second question. When Trump came to power, China played a specific game. They applied a formula of clan politics, which is purely Chinese, genuinely Chinese. You will all get in a minute what I mean. Trump came into power in 2017 on the 20th of January. During his campaign, he announced there would be a summit with Putin, but in April 2017, Xi Jinping, the summit was held in Malago, in Florida. If you're interested in the USA, you know that it was not the Department of State who prepared that visit, and it was not the Secretary of State, but it was Jared Kushner, son-in-law of Donald Trump. Chinese gave some money, and after this visit, Jared Kushner got ludicrous contract agreement. He got into possession of housing estate, so it was good business for him. And how did it happen? Xi Jinping, well, that's not something you're familiar with, for sure. Xi Jinping had an official visit to Finland. I will explain you later why to Finland. And then there was a communication that, well, he would rest during the weekend, but no one knew where. And only when he landed on Florida, it was indicated where this weekend took place. So the media decided to inform about this meeting only after it was confirmed that the meeting would take place. And during the meeting, a granddaughter of Trump, daughter of Ivanka Trump, Rabella, she was singing Noli Hua, a Chinese very popular song, and she boasted about knowing a bit of China. On top of that, 6 months later, the Chinese, there was a visit of Trump to China. I've been lecturing for 20 years. I spent 20 years in diplomacy, and there is, in diplomatic protocol, there is no official plus visit. There's nothing like that. But then Donald Trump went back to the country, said thank you, and 2 years later he announced trade war with China, which means that through this clan and mentality it was impossible to get to Trump. It seemed that Ivanka would get lots of approvals, agreements, she would build some housing estates, and that everything would be fine. But it is not fine. And the most distinguished strategists in China during the last week, they said, well, we are waiting for the next term of office of Trump because he will destroy things, and for us this will be a strategic opportunity. When it comes to what my colleague said, and when it comes to your first question, well, China is a continent, is an ancient civilization with its systems of values, but for the past 4 decades, China has not been uniform. And Xi Jinping is not the same as he was 20 or 30 years ago, because this is not adequate to what the reality looks like. First of all, when he came to power in December 78, the most important thing was that he fell victim to the cult of individual, and in the 80s he did everything he could to remove one-man power. That's something which I define in my book as a collective emperor. And this has been achieved. A 7-man committee has been established, and we know that they are the real decision makers, but we don't know the processes of decision making because those decisions are not transparent. That's something we don't know about, but we for sure know they are decision makers. In the 1980s, Xi Jinping draw conclusions because when he was sent during Cultural Revolution to some place, which we know from the only possible source, from the diaries of her daughter, because there was no other source. So when he was in the exile, he asked himself the following question: why peasants who had been dying because of hunger were in a terrible situation, and people in Hong Kong or in New York are in a fantastic position? That's the question he wanted to answer when he came into power, and that's where the spirit of entrepreneurship came into place. We think that in China everyone is meticulous, everyone is working really hard in uniforms for the sake of collectivity. But let's go to any Chinatown and let's have a look at the spirit of entrepreneurship, of individualism. That's the real face of China. But at the same time, Deng Xiaoping came to power in December 78, and in March 79 he imprisoned the first political decision maker, Champagne, because he opposed him. There is a wall of democracy for modernizations in China, and Deng Xiaoping, who was 28 years old back then, and he wrote the following thing in some journal: well, I would like to have the 5th modernization, democracy. Wintenon was sent to prison for 15 years, and Deng Xiaoping, who was awarded 2 years in a row the Man of the Year by the New York Times, said we have socialism or communism, we've got dictatorship, we've got the rules of one communist party, and there are ideas of Marxism, of Mao Zedong. The 4 basic principles have been introduced into the Chinese constitutions and are binding until now. So at the very beginning, the way towards a democratic political system has been closed. And, well, I wrote a book on Tiananmen Square massacre. That was my lesson learned from that time. And a change took place. Students, intelligentsia, they were They were massacred by tanks, and the faith in communism disappeared. And in my book, you will find sources on the basis of which the decision was taken. They would not want to have Marxism and Leninism, but nationalism, which since then has been growing. And when you have a look at the Chinese internet, you will be terrified, because what we have in Poland is really nothing compared to what they have on their internet. And we are going back to the roots of the Chinese civilization, Confucianism. This has lasted for 20 years, and in 2012, Xi Jinping came into power and changed the dimensions again, and the situation has changed dramatically, and Xi Jinping wants to change things. What's the official definition, constitutional definition of the political system which is binding in China? Socialism with Chinese nature. And the best book, apart from my book, by Yasen Huan from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Yasen Xuchen. He left China, went to the USA, and was awarded professor degree there. Capitalism with Chinese characteristics. That's the title of the book, and the Nobel Prize will be awarded to the person who will decide how much capitalism and how much socialism there is in the Chinese system. They are saying third way is best, and we are saying there's no such thing as third way. And Xi Jinping is changing the proportions between socialism, nationalism, capitalism, but this should be subject to discussion.
We can all feel like we can win the Nobel Prize because the European Union itself has won the Nobel Prize. So all of us would have like 1% of the Nobel Prize. But what would be these Chinese characteristics? What would be the Chinese nationalism? Well, I cannot really complete this task to provide you with a definition. I don't know what the form is and what the essence is. These two elements are interrelated, and Professor may know that there were two opinions about this book he was mentioning. One has already been published on the internet, one more is coming soon. But both opinions are very good. One opinion was was provided by a good censor, and the other one by a bad one. But Professor Góralczyk was right to say and to stress that the culture, the civilization is very important in China when it comes to shaping the society and the political system and the development of this country. As such, this is the fundamental question in China, and I would never question that. However, this usually what was being shaped and what is shaping, these two elements are always interrelated, and I can see this in China a lot. So we've got the culture, and the culture has shaped the Chinese state, and now the traditional bonds are falling apart, the traditional structures are falling apart. But we already have the Chinese state, which is shaping its new culture, this new nationalism, which is different than the one they used to have in the past. When you read history books, you can read that there are some northern barbarians, and they are the enemies because they would invade the Chinese state, and this, of course, helped shape the Chinese state. But this is not acknowledged by the Chinese people usually. So this big country, uniform country, this country emerged because the Chinese people had to protect themselves from invaders from the north. This could be from the Han period or from the Manchurian period or Mongolian period. There are different theories about this. But first you have this enemy, this barbarian enemy invading the country. But this has already been forgotten. They don't like talking about this. These barbarians from the north, they were incorporated into the Chinese culture, and they are no longer perceived as enemies. So who has become the new enemy? And this is some conscious cultural and history politics on the Chinese side. Why? They need a new enemy. They need to create a new enemy so that they can provide some justification and uniformization. And they refer to Japan and the Western countries as enemies because they think that these countries, Japan and Western countries, degraded China. And this degradation went on and on for 100 years. And that's what the Chinese people remember now. And who could be now a possible danger to the great renaissance of China? Again, the Western countries. And there are two more elements I'd like to mention, and then I will be completing my statement. So when you want to shape your culture in a conscious way, you've got the political system shaping the economy, but the political system also needs to react to what's going on in the economy. But we also have the soft power, and the soft power is based on economic politics, and it's more about politics than about economy, as I see it, but the economy is still involved in it to a great degree, and you have cultural politics. And we are already talking about a fusion of civilizations, so we should have cultural exchange, and a new article is going to be published soon about how the Chinese ally was established. This is a small case study, but it shows brilliantly how this politics of shaping culture on different levels works, even at UNESCO, because even there China is an important player. This is a very complex issue, but I think that this culture is falling apart and a new culture is emerging based on the previous one. I don't know whether this is authentic or not. This is just a very dynamic and complex process, but Professor wanted to add something to what I was saying. Professor, voice over to you. Yes, I'd like to refer to something you were saying, and I'd like to broaden the perspective. I think this is important. Ladies and gentlemen, when analyzing China, we often use tools which are just too simple. We refer to different stereotypes, to different images of China we have in our minds, and over 90% of Western literature about China is just about multiplying different concepts we've already had about China, and this has absolutely nothing to do with the reality that there is in China, and this has nothing to do with the real debate which is taking place in China. And I remember a debate which took place in the Nowy Świat street, and there were two experts of the Institute of Eastern Studies, which is a government research center, and they provided some analysis about the Communist Party in the era of Xi Jinping. And there was a clash of different opinions during this debate. And why? I would like to repeat now what I said then. And you can watch this on YouTube if you want. I said the following thing. If you want to analyze China right now, you need to do so on 4 different levels. First of all, it is the Communist Party of China, and this was taken into account by the experts because the party, Chinese Communist Party, equals the Chinese state. But there are 3 more elements you need to take into considerations, which I believe are just as important as the Communist Party. So the second level would be the bureaucracy. And this bureaucracy is something that was actually born in China. So when you talk about bureaucracy, you should remember that it started in China. Francis Fukuyama, and a book by him was published by our publishing house. And the first book by this author covering the universal history from the beginning of mankind until the French Revolution, well, half of that was devoted to the question of Chinese bureaucracy. So bureaucracy was created in China, and it is part of the Chinese DNA and the Chinese mentality. Now, the third level, which is often disregarded, until Xi Jinping took power, and he was a kid of a wealthy representative of the Chinese communist authorities. Well, before he took power, it was engineers that ruled the country, so it was a technocracy. There was a lot of engineering thinking involved in that government. And this is very different from what kind of thinking you have when you have a background in humanities, like we both have. So me, myself, and my colleague here, she is also a representative of the humanities. She specializes in Mongolian studies. And the fourth level, and this is presented very precisely in my book, I call this system a meritocracy. And now we start having some doubts whether the system we have right now under Xi Jinping is still a meritocracy. But what he managed was combining different structures we used to have here as well. Because if you go to China, you can see all those communist symbols. They are singing the International, and you have the Central Committee, and you have the red flags. And look how many Chinese people are members of the Communist Party. This looks like some real socialism. But this is, again, socialism with Chinese characteristics. And if you go further, you will see different things which you wouldn't have in the Soviet Union, for example, neither under Brezhnev nor under Khrushchev. But I don't want to go into details because I want you to read my book. So I'm not going to reveal everything. Please make sure to read my book. And they even managed to combine Confucianism with real socialism. And if you cannot understand it, well, you just keep thinking in stereotypes about China, which is just not right. Well, this socialism with Chinese characteristics, there is a clash of that with the U.S. governed by Donald Trump. And now we are going to have the first anniversary of the imprisonment of a lady representing the family to which Xiaowei belonged, and that daughter is now in Canada, and she calls his father more often now, and she's also working on her doctoral thesis, and this is like an international company. And well, so the daughter is under house arrest, but this is really a luxurious house, and she is wearing great clothes, and she enjoys a lot of freedom, and she has even a better contact now with her father. However, following this imprisonment, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavrov, two diplomats, two businessmen with different backgrounds, well, they were arrested in Beijing, and there is absolutely no idea where they are. They have no access to lawyers, they have no access to their families, and I've even read that one of them lost his glasses. His glasses were taken away from him in order to degrade him. So now we are talking about like a war, actually, with Chinese characteristics, referring to the case of Xiaowei, this family story, but that daughter can do anything she likes under this house arrest, and this is not the same in China, where these two men have been imprisoned. But please start, because my statement is going to be longer. Okay, I will be precise as always. My statement is not like a professor's statement. So as far as development is concerned, I think we tend to think that the superpower of the US is based on entrepreneurship and innovation. However, you need to remember that it is still the state that is involved in innovations. We have this DARPA military agency that blocked the Chinese from taking over an important German company. And I think Huawei is a very interesting example. And why? Because this is about taking over a certain model. We have a transfer of technologies from the military sector into the private sector. And this is like a breakthrough. Why? There is a Chinese company that has become a global player. This is just one thing, but there is more to it. Because this would never happen in Russia, for example. There are great engineers in Russia, and there is also a great military industry. However, that industry in Russia is devoted to fulfilling military purposes and not civil purposes, and that's why the Russian economy is so different from the US economy or even the Chinese economy. And the boss of Huawei used to be a military engineer, and we can see how these technologies were transferred from the military sector into the private sector. Spies were used and some know-how was taken over from the United States of America, but later that was further developed, and that's why Huawei is seen as a technology leader. And these two men that were arrested in China, one of them met the leader of North Korea, so this is for sure a fascinating person. I think he's of Canadian origin as well. However, I think there is more to it, and we do not see the full picture right now until the official documents are still confidential. We cannot know what really lies behind it. So if these documents are not disclosed during our lifetime, we'll never get to know what there is behind the story. At least one of these two men is a person that so many secrets are connected with.
Okay, so let me now give the following statement. When 40 years ago Xi Jinping came to power, it was possible for us not to deal with China, and I decided to deal with China anyway, and people looked at me, they were curious why I was doing that. This was 40 years ago. And now there are two things which should be said at the onset. China, in the period starting from Christ to Napoleon War, were the biggest organism on the globe. And during the time of Three Kingdoms and internal fights, India was the most prominent when it comes to economy. So from the point of view of Chinese intellectuals, intelligentsia, the last 200 years were different. It's something different, that the world is ruling the world. We should get back to the world of civilization, to the state of civilization. So they have the impression that the world has changed, and America would like to make America great again, and America first. And in the Chinese DNA, it is embedded that China is the only right civilization under the sky, and we should get back to power. And it's not important which dynasty is ruling. It's important that we rule the world. And when China entered the era of 100 years of national humiliation, according to Angus Madison, they contributed to the world GDP at the rate of 32.8%. And then the pandemic came to power, and it turned out that China contributes to the world GDP at the rate of 3.5%, which is a tenfold decrease. And now, since 2015, when it comes to spending power, China is the biggest economy in the world. I understood their intentions. All the more so if there is a peaceful unification with Taiwan, because there are two organisms, the Chinese Republic and there is the Chinese Republic in Taiwan, which is a constitutional extension of the Chinese state, which has been there for a long time, and Taiwan has a GDP which is comparable to Poland. So unification with Taiwan would automatically mean that China would become the most powerful organism in the earth, both in also in nominal terms. And Deng Xiaoping, having in mind enormous poverty, and he feels responsible for telling the Chinese people to introduce those big jump and cultural revolution. And when he was withdrawing, he left two testimonies in which he wrote that China is a low profile. China should maintain low profile, should rebuild its power in a silent way. And then it was precisely stated what should be done. First of all, two objectives, millennial objectives. First of all, China should not be driven by export, but by strong internal market. And in order for internal market to be created, we need a middle class, which is a huge enterprise for decades, and it is going on right now. Until 2049, the China would like to have a renaissance, great renaissance. So a sine qua non condition is to have unification of Taiwan, and it is also a condition for China to become a civilizational, cultural center in the world. So we are not talking about economy, but about culture and civilization. When we have a look at any book of a Chinese strategist, in Shedu, Colonel Luke Shedu, who proposed a concept which was translated to English as a Chinese dream, then there is only one opponent, the United States of America. 1% is devoted to Russia, 1% to India, but the rest goes to America. America is the main point of reference, and Xi Jinping announced such things, which was worrying. But then in 2013, a year after he came to power, he announced we would have two silver roads and two Silk Roads, and Americans were furious about this. And in 2017, new strategic documents were devised. Customs war, trade war. The truth is, but in fact, it's not true. So, in fact, it is not true. So, what is meant here is that during the last 2 decades in China, a couple of major changes took place. Two changes, two transformations, true transformations. One of them in 2015, when investments to China, which were always huge, 1 billion customers, when investments from China are bigger than investments flowing into China. And since 2015, China is an exporter of capital, and we should realize that. And for the past 2 or 3 years, there's been a book which luckily has been translated into Polish by us, and it was published in Polish. Artificial intelligence. It was written by a Taiwan person who was brought up in the USA, and he's very successful in continental China right now. He was born in Taiwan, Li Kaihu, that's his name. Have a look at this book, because he's a real role model. He's an important person, the same surname. I think he means for Taiwan as much as Bill Gates means for Microsoft. He led Google for some time in the USA. He was a representative of Google, and since 2009 he's got his own business in the Republic of China. And this is a book which is really enlightening because it shows very precisely, and it is a very first narrative of this kind in Poland, a narrative from the inside. And it shows that China now surpasses United States when it comes to technology, Huawei, 5G, artificial intelligence, and non-cash operations. These are areas where China surpasses the United States. And when it comes to fast railway, which was initiated in 2007, 12 years ago, they've got 85 years of global share. And we've got Shinkansen, TGV, and let's not mention Pendolino here. In this sense, it is a clash of civilizations, of structures, and of strategies, geostrategies, and it is no longer trade war or customs war. Where is America right now? America is as polarized as Poland. It has its clashes within the country, but there is a consensus in the USA concerning one thing only, and this thing is China. Irregardless of whether we have Trump or we do not have Trump, we will have the same course towards China. Okay, so and what about the society? But let me first refer to what Professor said, just to complement his statement. When it comes to investments, we should remember about one more thing. We are we are supposed to talk about economic aspects here, and we focus on China only. But let me give you a good example. We are saying that the Chinese superpower is built on foreign investments, and that's very much true, and that's something which is very specific for China when compared to the development of other states in this part of Asia. But also internal public investments played a crucial role there, and this should be mentioned as well. Let me also tell you that we are talking about investments going out of China, and this is a problem for some economic theories, because we've got a third world country which is a donor of investments for first world countries, and this is taking place right now because Chinese money buys technological companies from the West. But we should not forget about the fact that the Chinese companies still lack some know-how. For instance, acquisition of Cookie, a company which produces robots. This is crucial, and I think Germans are not happy about it. Well, they are saying that their company has been acquired by the Chinese, but we should remember that the Chinese are lacking know-how. We've got GDPR and so on and so forth. That's why the European Union is at a different position than, for instance, the United States. But let's make a step forward. I'm in a working group 16+1, and very often I face criticism of political scientists active in our area. They say, well, you deal with China. China is a very distant place, and China is very close to us. In fact, yes, but here in Europe, China behaves in a way which is determined by what's going on in their country, far away. And now Consalnet. Well, we were... It was strange for us that a competition office said no, but it was the Chinese who withdrew, and we've got also a supervisory body which can reduce the outflow of capital, because we should remember about the control of capital and some investments. I'm not saying that Consalment's investments are just a pretext for cash to go out to China, and it is a very complex and dynamic game. It's not only external, it's not only about the European Union blocking Chinese investments, but it's also about what's going on inside, supervisory bodies competing with each other, companies trying to make cash flow out, and the supervisory body, in case of Consulnet, said, well, you are not stable when it comes to finances. So, no, we were lucky, probably, that it was the Chinese who withdrew themselves. Just a short comment from my side. When it comes to social affairs, if, technology can be stolen or copied in a more or less successful way, when it comes to social changes, how is it possible to implement social changes so that people can follow and authorities can follow? Well, let me speak about this because that's my favorite topic. Last week I took part in an annual summit between Poland and China. It took place for the ninth time, and this time it took place in China. I was the only representative of Poland, of our region, which is also a sign of some things, and this has not taken place for the first time. And the new Commissioner on Trade took part in the summit, former Prime Minister of Ireland, and he was very proud, saying that we signed an agreement on the protection of brands and own names. Well, the fact is that the Chinese have stolen so many things so far, and now they have their own brands which they want to protect from the West. That's why they are eager to sign agreements right now. They would not have been eager to sign such agreements some time ago. And another crucial thing for you to learn, if you decided to come to us on Saturday morning, well, China has two challenges to face. The first of those challenges concerns quality and quantity ratio, and this is always the most difficult test, the most difficult challenge. Xi Jinping, when it comes to millennial goals, during the party convention in 2017, he supplemented those two goals by another one. By 2035, China should be a society of innovation. China should no longer steal and then create things, but they will surpass other nations and be a role model. When I was writing my book on the Great Renaissance, I was wondering how this is possible for people who are familiar with the Chinese education system. Well, in the Chinese education system, people were always taught about Confucianism, Marxism, and so on and so forth. So how can we adopt social change? And then I found some explanation, very dramatic but also logical. Ladies and gentlemen, I know this. I've been following this for some time now. For some time now, Xi Jinping, well, we know the following thing. Xi Jinping was with an official visit to Finland. I've already talked about it. And Chinese are sending delegations to Finland every 2 weeks. And not in order to have a look at snow, because in Manchuria there's more snow than in Finland. Neither do they want to build a Santa Claus in their country. The aim of those visits is to have a look at the Finnish education system, because the Finnish education system, it's the very best in the world, and China wants to copy this system and implement this system in their country. And it turns out that when it comes to artificial intelligence, China is number one. and United States is number 2. Europe does not play any role there, so there are 2 players when it comes to artificial intelligence. And China fulfills 3 out of 4 conditions that are necessary to have control over artificial intelligence in the future. The first condition is political will, which is lacking in the US, but is present in China. The second condition, and you've mentioned that, $1,400,000,000. This is cloud, this is big data, big societies, big entities, bigger chance that this will develop. China fulfills this condition, this criterion. The third criterion, we need absolute, brutal, like the Huawei boss, former colonel of the Chinese army, who either survived or died. If they survived, this means they're good, they're entrepreneurial, they are meticulous, they are really good and hard-working businessmen. And they do have such people. 3 criteria are met. The 4th criterion has not been met yet. They still need lots of engineers who will implement all those solutions. And this has been described by someone who lives in China, who wrote 3 bestsellers in Chinese, and now he's been suffering from cancer, and he thinks this might be his last book. That's why he decided to publish it in English, and I'm really happy that it's been translated into Polish. And he writes that we do have artificial intelligence, we've got entrepreneurship, innovative nature, and so on and so forth. Mr. Rafał Tomański fits here. He's entrepreneurial, he's innovative, but he is not. He does not want to follow orders, which is not good, which is something that makes it impossible for him to take part in this enterprise. But we do have certain perspective for China to be innovative, but at the same time to be controlled.
So now I would like to combine both statements, but we haven't had an argument what we're talking about. I have not even started arguing with you, but you've mentioned social issues and the other colleague mentioned technical issues, so we have 2 different elements, and I would like to add something that relates to the economy. This is not so simple, because China can indeed be a leader in certain segments, but not in all of them. Microprocessors, for example, they are necessary for Huawei, and they are manufactured in the US or in Europe and not in China, provided that Europe is even interested in selling them. So in a midterm perspective, this could be a problem for China. So I'd say we have 2 different organisms that compete with each other, and to manufacture one Huawei phone, they need some 70 companies in that supply chain that will provide the components you need to manufacture the phone, the final product. And when you look at international relations, you can see that China is realistic, it's behaving like a real superpower. However, from the point of view of economics, you will see this different. There is one more player involved in this, and these are the big multinationals. They have benefited from globalization, from entering new markets, and the supply chains are very complicated nowadays. And all these multinationals are interrelated, and they depend on one another, and China cannot take everything over. And there is something that can shake the fundamentals of the world. Indeed, China could create complete supply chains within its own country. However, this is not a mid-term perspective, this is a long-term perspective. But China is doing what it can do to go into that directions, because microprocessors right now, they thought they would always be able to buy them in the States, but now they can see that this could be a problem. problem someday. So right now there is this interdependency, and we have Boeing, we have big multinationals that are lobbying with both countries, the US and China, and these multinationals are also global players. In political terms, I think this is the crucial issue, and General Kozie is with us here. He used to be the chief officer at the Office of National Security, and I'd like you to remember something. Everyone is asking this question, could we have another Cold War? Next Wednesday at Koźmiński Academy there will be 3 panel discussions devoted to this topic, the conflict between China and the US. Could this be a new Cold War? China is doing everything for there not to be a dualism, even though there are some strategic statements in China, and there is strategic research in China that refers only to the US. And for the first time since 1998, we've had these summits between China and the European Union, and there will be 2 next year, one in April, the normal one, and one more next year in the city of Leipzig in Germany. An extraordinary summit. Why? Because this war that Trump has started is not just a war against China, it is also a war against the European Union, against Germany, for example. So this is actually like a geopolitical game. And I'm afraid, and this is based on the knowledge I have, this is not based on my obsession, this is based on the knowledge I have, there could be a technological Cold War. Nowadays, China has an alternative system. They have its own GPS, they have its own Google, they have its own YouTube. They have an alternative for everything. And I read an article in Gazeta Wyborcza. Someone took our smartphones to China, and they were he was not able to use them within this Chinese internet system because they just wouldn't fit. And that's the danger we have, because this is like another universe, and it's very difficult to establish where this comes from, because it's easy when you take the example of one smartphone, but if you go into details, it becomes really a very complex and dangerous world, and that's what I'm afraid of, a Cold War in technological terms. Also, consumption. Look at the scale of China. How many people live in China? Well, certainly enough for China to be independent. Would you agree with me, or that this domestic market is big enough for China to be just independent? I think China is a superpower that is being reborn, that is gaining power and importance. Well, how was it possible that the US became a superpower? How was it possible for the UK to become a superpower in the past? They needed external markets. A superpower which is growing importance needs external markets, and whatever is being said in Davos or in Böll, so this is the Chinese Davos, all those statements made at those summits are clear. We want globalization, we want open markets. And what is Trump saying? We need barriers, we need customs. What is China saying? We need free movement of goods, we need free markets. So this is like the world we used to know, but upside down, because now we have this isolation promoted by the US and not by China, because China is right now advocating open markets and an open global economy. Today we have the 30th of November, and the Chinese Communist Party had a meeting at the beginning of November, which was very important. There were no comments about it here in Poland, but it was very important for the internal politics. There is a saying in Chinese, so that was said in Chinese now, And it means you have politics on, like up there, and down there you have counter-politics. And right now we are looking for saving money, and we want to transfer a lot of money from infrastructure into research and development, into innovations. That's the step China wants to take. However, for 30 years, all these local governors have been rewarded for constructing infrastructure. So now China has some 300% of public debt as compared to its GDP. So if they didn't have all these foreign currency reserves, this would be a problem. So now you need to discipline the local governments, the local authorities, so that they obey the instructions provided from above. And that's why there is more and more control, and this control is becoming more and more strict. But Xi Jinping made sure that he would have a lifetime term, not just 2 short office terms. He wanted to be the leader for his lifetime. And I can assure you, this older generation doesn't like it in China, because this is going too fast. And what Xiaoping established in China is falling apart right now. He wanted to have a collective emperor. He wanted a system of checks and balances. And the elder generation of Chinese people likes that, and they're not happy this is now being dismantled. Now this public debt, if you visit the website of the International Monetary Fund, you can see the public debt relating to general government. So this is the public, well, as related to the GDP, but it's related to the general government, because this is the public debt generated by public authorities, but it does not specify that this is something that relates just to the central government and not to the local government. And this is an important difference, because the central government would be like 40% in China. And you have to take the local governments and the public debt generated by the local governments as well. But this is like a secret, an official secret in China, and this is just not transparent. And even if you look at Poland, our local governments have generated a debt on the financial market, and this is illustrated in the financial statements they provide, but they can also take loans from not proper banks. And then this will not be shown in the statistics and the reports and the financial statements. And also you have debts and credits taken by private households, for example, and this is not included in the statistics either. And this is really a sensible issue for China, and this might result in significant instability. They might cope with it. However, if you promote growth by public investments, well, there is an end to it, because when this infrastructure started being built, this was all financed by public money, but there was a return on all those investments. And right now you have all those investments, but you do no longer have this return on the investments you make, so it might be difficult for you to pay your debts back. And central banking institutions are saying here in Poland that we have caused certain problems here. And in China, we have like a parallel financial system, which is not official. These are not proper banks. The national banks are involved within that system, but they do not include that in their official financial statements. So we have like a quasi banks or shadow banking system on a large scale in China, and I've used Chinese banking services, and my experience has shown that if you open up an account at a public bank in one region, you will not have access to your money in another region. It's unimaginable for us, but that's the case. I've had that experience myself. So that financial system is not as developed as it is in the West. It's very specific. It works in a different way than what we are used to, and I don't think that it has been described properly in literature. So we have some analysis, but there is no complete complex analysis of this banking system, which is unique, given all the characteristics of China. Well, the time is almost over, and we have not yet talked about the main topic related to China now. And the professor was referring to Hong Kong, and when we agreed about what we would talk about today, we decided that we would talk about Hong Kong, because as for geography, well, you can see that we have Beijing in the north and Hong Kong is in the south, and there is a conflict between Hong Kong and Beijing. Because Beijing is saying that Hong Kong is being financed by someone from outside, and people who live in Hong Kong feel that their independence is something that comes really from within their soul. And they don't like the idea of being taken over by China. So what is by mainland China? So what is your perception of this conflict? Does it affect the Chinese politics in any way, or this is just a conflict that will go away after some time? And do you think that what is going on in Hong Kong is really being financed by someone from outside? And also, do you think that, well, we have seen that China, the central government in China, has been able to crush any protest. Why this one small protest in Hong Kong cannot be crushed by the central government in China now? Well, I've already written an article about it. It was in September, and I think it's still up to date. And there is also a text published in the newspaper Rzeczpospolita. It is an article by the ambassador of the Chinese People's Republic in Poland. When Hong Kong rejoined mainland China, it had 7.5 million people, and it contributed to 16.5% of Chinese GDP. So it was some 20 years ago, and it was crucial for China, for mainland China, because even though it was so small and it had just 7.5 million people, it contributed to 16.5% of the Chinese GDP. Now it contributes just to 3% of Chinese GDP. So Hong Kong is no longer as important as it used to be. And well, I've been to Hong Kong many times, and I've published articles about Hong Kong. For me, this is clear. There was a potential, there had been potential for these conflicts for a long time. We know this Gini coefficient. This is about social inequalities. And there was a certain range of this coefficient, and which is just dangerous. So we were able to tell that this would come. So you might even wonder why this conflict has started only now and not many years ago. So it's very difficult in Hong Kong to have a nice apartment, for example, if you do not know the right people, if you are not born into the right family, for example. So these social inequalities are a big problem in Hong Kong. But still, it is one of the most open economies of the world. And there is one more thing that made people angry. 2 years ago, this parliament, Chinese parliament, adopted a new draft, and they decided that in the valley of the Pearl River, the biggest megapolis in the world would be built. And the megapolis is a city that has over 10 million people. In Europe, you have just two cities which are so big. You have London and Paris, where maybe Moscow could be close. And in China, you have over 30 cities like that, with over 10 million people, 10 million inhabitants. So this megapolis was supposed to be the biggest in the world, and, well, if you think about it, they were able to construct a bridge joining Hong Kong and Macau. This is part of this project. There is more to it, and the Hong Kong youth can see this. They are constructing very fast. Not like in Warsaw, we have a new subway line every 10 years. They have one new subway line every 3 months, for example, because they want you to be able to reach any point within the city within 50 minutes. So once you are in the underground, it should not take more than 15 minutes to reach any spot in that city. And the youth, they can see that, and they understand in 7 or 8 years, Hong Kong will just be a district of one big megapolis. And then the central government will say, what kind of independence do you want to have? You are just a small district of a big city. And when this conflict started in Hong Kong, the central government, of course, made sure that Shenzhen would be promoted as a perfect region and a perfect city in the People's Republic of China. I remember Shenzhen as a rural region, and right now it is a big city with 16-17 million people, and that's also the place where the head office of Huawei is located. So I can confirm that the central government will do anything in order not to have a military intervention, because they want to win something more out of it. It's not about Hong Kong. You know, you can just take your time, you can wait, you can let Hong Kong demonstrate for as long as it wants, and they will just take care of Shenzhen. But what they care about is not Hong Kong. What they care about is Taiwan. In January next year, there will be elections in Taiwan. And I was in Taiwan in summer last year, so like 1.5 years ago. And when I was there, everyone was saying that the administration would change in Taiwan because this Democratic Party in Taiwan is not able to cope with the economy, because Beijing is putting so much pressure on Taiwan. So we remember that great agreement of 2010. One big economic organism was created in China, and you can see that Taiwanese business people have a lot of investments in mainland China.
Kuomintang was successful in all opinion polls until the 9th of June this year, and this entity is open to dialogue on peaceful unification. But when we have a look at the current opinion polls of Taipei Times, which is an English-speaking journal, the tendency has been reversed. After the upcoming elections, campaign will not be successful, and there will be no change in power, and peaceful reunification will not take place. And well, some people dream about the unification of both Chinese organisms. So the situation has become complicated, and there is the third dimension to it, the stage of of constructing things is over, and we've got General Electric, General Motors, 1 billion customers, and so on and so forth. And then we had Kentucky Fried Chicken, Coca-Cola, because of 1 billion consumers. But this era has come to an end, and an era of strategic competition has started. As you know, that when we deal with strategic competition, proxy war starts. And I'm really sad that young people in Hong Kong are to a high extent turn away, and that's unfortunately because of conflicting interests coming from both parts of the world. To wrap up, if army would be introduced and if a massacre would take place in Hong Kong, the massacre like the one in Tiananmen Square, then we would have no peaceful unification. So the decision was not taken. Now, the American strategists are aware of what the situation looks like as well. So it's not only Chinese strategists that know how things go, and 2 bills were adopted in the USA. Trump was not eager to sign the bills because he promised something to Xi Jinping, but finally he signed the bills, and we have a clash of 2 superpowers in Hong Kong, unfortunately. Well, I'm not a specialist on Hong Kong. 2 small remarks. One is quite obvious, but, well, it's important. We might marginalize Hong Kong, but it's not how the Chinese authorities declare that all the functions would be taken over by Xinjiang. Let's remember that Hong Kong was an important financial and economic hub. It was a window to the world. It was possible to trade with the Chinese currency, which is important in the context of internationalization. So Hong Kong played an important role. But the exchange rate and the supply of currency are limited to a high extent, and speculations on yuan started. Hong Kong was crushed, and in Hong Kong we do have institutions, we do have law, we've got certain practice, we've got a certain image, respect, and financial institutions will not move to Shenzhen. If Hong Kong loses, this does not necessarily mean that the other city wins. And there's one more element which has not been mentioned. I don't want to be a devil's advocate here, but there was an episode which, well, in the Polish press was not covered. In foreign press it was not covered as well. Some media mentioned that medium-sized banks have problems, Baotou, Xinjiao in China, Shaoxi and similar banks. But the situation was much more complicated and difficult. Shentun, who was very entrepreneurial, he took over assets in banks above the limits, safety limits, and this has not been mentioned anywhere. And this scandal was hidden, was not revealed because it was a danger, a threat to the stability of a global financial system. And interestingly, this took place in May this year, although things started already in March. This guy flew to Hong Kong. Hong Kong did not want to have him subject to extradition, and this was the starting point for the protests that are taking place right now. Obviously, this is really complicated, and it can't be described in a couple of words, but that's something the Chinese wanted to hide because international relations are built on trust, so they didn't want media to give coverage to this problem. Well, Hong Kong was and still is a window to tax havens. We've got statistical data on trade between Poland and China, and they do not fit in any formula. It turns out that it was in Hong Kong and in tax havens that this money was lost, was hidden somewhere, and it's really lucrative. There are lots of lucrative interests in Hong Kong. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really sorry to say that, but the debate has come to an end. We talked about a country, a continent, which is really huge. We should have double as much time as we had, because there are lots of issues to be discussed, and I hope that at least some of the issues have been raised, but I'm really glad that the discussion took place. I would like to extend my thanks to our distinguished guests, and I'd like to thank the audience for being with us today, and I'd like to invite you to the next panel today. Thank you.